So welcome to our unit on art, actually our first of two units on art. This one is the representation of, by artists of the 1918 flu pandemic. And we have with us Professor Yvonne Widenor, who teaches art history at Canisius College and travels with students to visit museums around the world and does all sorts of wonderful things. But she will be better at explaining how wonderful she is than I am. Oh, and I also wanted to point out that Yvonne has also worked with me on our mural project at Canisius, which was unveiled shortly before the pandemic shut down. But when things are back to normal and people can get back on campus, I would encourage people to check out our two murals on campus, one in Old Main 314 and the other in the alumni hallway between Old Main and the library. So thank you for your work on that. And oh, and Yvonne has also worked with me on the Borders and Migrations Initiative. So I don't want to forget those things as well. So Yvonne, would you like to say a few things about who you are and what you do?
Certainly. I am a born and bred Buffalonian who has so enjoyed teaching at Canisius College. I was fresh out of graduate school when I first started. My first course was a survey of pre-Columbian and Native American art, because that was an opportunity to introduce students to cultures other than European and Native North American, or North American, I should say. But it gave me such a great stepping stone into other courses and what I could teach and what I wanted to teach. One of the popular notions when I was a graduate student was the idea that courses may not necessarily stay as sequential, such as medieval art. Then you would take Renaissance art, then you would take Baroque art, but that you could do thematic courses. So I developed this course that is a core capstone at Canisius about self-portraiture. Self-portraits are such a wonderful opportunity for us to see how artists view themselves and how they create a sense of their legacy, their identity, how they might brand themselves, if I can use terms from other disciplines. And for this presentation, we look at the self-portraits of Edvard Munch and Ivan Sheila as a way to see how they processed life in the early 20th century and late 19th century.
So that is a perfect segue to your presentation. I will get the PowerPoint up just a minute, but I also want, for those of you viewing this particular module, to show people that I am also wearing the elements of a portraitist artist, Frida Kahlo. So, and I think actually we may have an opportunity to talk about her as well.
Fantastic.
So let me get to our presentation. And there we are. So Yvonne, I will let you go ahead and we can stop at any point for questions too.
Fantastic. Now, do I drive or do you?
No, I do.
Okay, drive.
There we are.
Most of us know Edvard Munch from his self-portrait entitled The Scream, but there is so much more to his life. We are given the sense that as an artist born in Norway, he was on the periphery of the artistic world in Europe in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But that did not stop him from pursuing this way of negotiating the world. We know that his father became rather depressed and then later obsessed with piety and with religious images and the word of God as a way for him to cope with the death of his wife and his daughter. Edvard was actually then sort of co-parented by an aunt who was an artist. And she is the first person who put a pencil in his hand and offered the opportunity to start expressing his feelings, his thoughts about the world on two-dimensional surfaces. And I think that's part of his success, that he has become a well-known artist because he could depict suffering and pain, sometimes his own, sometimes universal ideas of suffering and pain in his work. And he wasn't shy about it. Next slide. And so I'd like to start off by giving us a trajectory. His early self-portrait here is one of someone just becoming a sense of himself. He was 22 years old when he painted the self-portrait. And for me, that the gaze is kind of intriguing, that it's a side eye view of the world. Most likely he's using a mirror to create this self-portrait. Previous artists might have just drawn or painted or sculpted from the imagination, but we imagine that 19th and 20th century artists would rely on a mirror or maybe a photograph as a reference when creating their self-portraits. Next one.
I actually find this particular one very modern, sort of the side eye and sort of an arrogant look. It's quite interesting.
This is the most famous. Not many people know that this is considered a self-portrait. He wrote in his journals that while taking a walk with friends, he began to hear this infinite scream of nature. And so we believe the figure in the foreground of this collection of paintings, he painted 3 different versions of the scream, are self-portraits, but they really do convey this sense of the fear of the power of nature. I think many people might encounter this if you step away from the city and urban noise, chaos, and you encounter the beauty and the power of nature. It might overwhelm you. It might be so much that you would need to cover your ears. And so here you can see in this version of the scream, this very brilliant sunset and the landscape and how abstractly he painted it, but it gives you a sense of the movement of water, perhaps, or of the energy, the psychic energy of the world around us. And I often ask my students, do you think he is the vessel of the scream, or is he reacting to hearing the scream by covering his ears, opening up his eyes, and then his gaping mouth? I think it can go either way. I kind of like the idea that we can interpret this one in a number of different ways.
It's a very interesting question that, I mean, that have both of those things could be true, right? I wonder what you think about the popularization of this image, and through its popularization, the decontextualization of it.
It has become quite popular. If you even think of the movie series Scream, with the mask that the figure wears, it looks like a monk mask. So many representations, when they're taken out of context, they lose their significance. And we talk about this in class as well. When something becomes watered down or it becomes so overtly utilized, you can imagine the Munch Museum in Norway is selling coffee mugs and socks and ties and everything to celebrate the popularity of these artworks. But every time I put on my pair of the Scream socks, I think about that infinite scream of nature. I think of that overwhelming impact that I might find if I'm out hiking in the woods or looking at Niagara Falls, or just coming across such beauty, and perhaps such overwhelming beauty. Now, I might not cover my ears, I might not scream, but I have a reaction to it. And that's why I really like teaching this class to students across disciplines, because not many of them are aware of the context in which he created these pieces. And the excerpt even from his diary really does give us a better sense of what he was thinking when creating it.
I also think it's fascinating, the enormous infinite scream of nature, as he wrote. But as a society, we have continued to grow further and further away from nature. And I wonder if our own sort of cultural scream when confronted with nature is because it's so foreign to us in many respects. We've civilized so much of it away that we're not connected anymore.
I agree. I think that, you know, the more that students and anyone really can just go out and touch nature. That's a phrase that a friend of mine uses. She would take weekly long hikes, but daily walks, because she just felt so strongly that to have that fresh air in your lungs, to look at the flowers, see the trees, listen to the birds, you really do have this connection that is so important to our physical, mental well-being.
You know, you mentioned something interesting about listening to the birds, because I've noticed that during this particular time, because of quarantine and much less commuting, much less traffic, I feel that there's both more animals around, and I live in the city, but I feel there's more animals around and I hear them more in ways I have not before. It's sort of like humanity has taken a bit of a pause, and nature is sort of reminding us that we still live in nature.
Oh, absolutely. We've seen the news reports of animals now, you know, returning into spaces that are normally so busy with traffic, roaming the streets. I live in a pretty wooded area right now, but I grew up further away from the city of Buffalo. So I got to grow up in the forest. So I was always hearing the birds. It was the sound of a car that was the odd thing. And it was more the, you know, the enjoyment of listening to the wind through the trees, and taking walks in the woods. That was one of our favorite pastimes. And I would like to continue that with our sons. We buy books, you know, the 50 best hiking places in Western New York. My husband and I visited one in 2001, so 49 to go. But it really, it really is. It's really a way to better hear that presence of the natural world.
Mm-hmm. And maybe that's a silver lining to this whole pandemic, is that it has given us pause to maybe reconnect with nature, or to see nature back. And this is an opportune moment for me to remind people that we also will have a unit up by Dr. Russell about animals and their interrelationship with the pandemic. So check that out too. Shall we go to the next one?
Sure.
Oh wait, this is still part of
The same one, but the question then is raised, is this an allegorical self-portrait? This doesn't physically present what we know Munch looked like. So is this an allegory? And that, of course, is something that can take us farther back into the history of art, where allegorical figures could represent the beauty of nature, the power of music, and how artists would incorporate those types of images. So and it also asks about that, our questions, that idea of him reacting to hearing the scream, echoing it, or making it. And I think, you know, many of us might confront those moments during the pandemic where we might need to let out a scream or echo someone else's scream that can be, you know, related to the fears that have accumulated around us, how much we watch the news and how engaged we are with current events, or how much we try to shield our family members from those events. And, you know, that's a difficult thing too, acting as a buffer or a shield between you and the rest of the world, or you and your family.
Right.
That's going to take a mental toll as well.
I think too, this scream metaphorically could also connect to the current protests going on. I think that there's an interesting correlation between the pandemic and quarantine and the George Floyd inspired protests, that there's some interesting ways in which these things have dovetailed and created new spaces for expressing these screams, if you will.
Oh, absolutely. And as we move further through his life, we learn that Munch becomes quite popular. He receives commissions in different parts of Europe, and it has, I think, a very deep way of cutting into how he presents himself, with self-portrait with skeleton arm, I mentioned the use of resting an arm on the picture frame and sort of breaking the picture plane. This is a tradition that's gone on with many portraits leading back to the 1400s in Europe. But instead of his human arm, it's a skeletal arm. So now it's adding this element of life and death. And the way he's presented his head sort of ghost-like and hovering in this space is also quite intriguing. How would we look at this from the perspective of a psychologist looking at a self-portrait that references death, that tries to engage a connection with the viewer by leaning the arm on the edge of the image, but then the image isn't very three-dimensional or representational of our reality. What were some of your reactions to this one?
Well, it's interesting, and I didn't think about it until just now, that it reminds me of actually the images of George Floyd and other people that are being commemorated, that we often get just a disembodied head. And I didn't make that connection until you were talking about it. And those are images also associated with death, right? And they're images about how do we as a culture understand the death of these Black and brown people. And I don't mean to imply that Monk is commenting that way, but it is a comment about life and death in this self-portrait. And this sort of hovering head there it's sort of fascinating what that means and how we interpret that culturally.
Right, we wonder what was he thinking when creating a self-portrait like this. It is so stark and has such distinct contrasts, where you think a self-portrait would want to present life and psychic energy, mental energy, emotional energy, but this one seems so flat.
It's
And
also,
then
no, sorry.
it's okay.
It's also he's looking at you, whereas the one when he was younger with the side eye there's something sort of sassy or snarky about it. This one is much more, well, mature, obviously,
but also downcast. If you notice, his eyes are sort of half closed.
a bit tired, yeah.
Yeah, it has this sense of maybe, mental fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
Even we think of artists being as they become more successful, they are sort of rising in their trajectory, but that's probably, the career part of their life. Their physical, mental well-being might take a downturn at some point because there's so much work or there's pressure to perfect. And here he's negotiating with patrons at this time. He's receiving commissions from families to do family portraits. So there's probably that sense of pressure too.
Right.
And
Right.
his artwork isn't idealized. He doesn't romanticize people.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they look quite ghost-like or almost two-dimensional, as if they have more of a spirit being presented rather than a three-dimensional form.
Was that true in the commissioned portraits as well?
I haven't spent much time looking at the commissioned portraits from this period. I am more interested in the self-portraits.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some of his landscapes as well. And there are so many resources from the National Museum, or the Munch Museum in Oslo, that you could certainly delve into and look at some of his other work. One of their recent exhibits was Munch and Van Gogh, looking at their self-portraits. And to me, that was such a great conversation of artists' careers.
Right. It's fascinating.
Yeah. And then from the same year, he depicts himself in another sort of hazy, murky environment. You can see that he's well-dressed. And so he's trying to establish himself perhaps as an artist of renown. But his gaze towards us still has that sort of mature, older, wiser, but also tired. Maybe the fatigue is still setting in. Here he is 31 years old. And I think that his time spent in Berlin cavorting with other artists, not only painters, but people like August Sternberg and poets and their ideas of well, their interest in mysticism and the occult might have influenced how he presents himself.
I quite like this one. I don't really have a reason why, but I quite like this one. There's a bit more color, well, except for the screen, there's a bit more color than some of his other self-portraits have been, and a little more embodiment of the self.
Very much so. And I think he also, the way he's presenting himself, you can link him back to Manet or Monet or other established artists earlier in the 19th century. But the people who are really asserting themselves as members of the art world, you know, reading literature of their contemporaries, actively engaged in challenging the notions of what art could and couldn't be. I often think of Gustav Corbett. Mm-hmm. When I look at this one, how he's dressed up and so well-to-do, because Corbett was really painting representations of the real world around him, the peasants, the people who were the cogs in the wheel that made industry, that made contemporary life move. And well, Munch doesn't really do that with his self-portraits. I think he's putting on masks. Mm-hmm. Quite frankly, with this one, perhaps there's some references to mysticism and things that his friends were interested in, but he doesn't. I think the scream reveals a little bit more than his other self-portraits at this time. We know also that he has developed an issue with alcoholism, and he's also having very destructive relationships with women. And so that could also key into how he sees himself and how he thinks the world ought to see him.
That is interesting. I did not know that about his personal life.
So self-portrait in hell. In this discussion, James Hall in the Self-Portrait of Cultural History talks about him presenting himself as an androgynous being. I don't necessarily dispute that, but I think it's kind of interesting, our notions, perhaps our 21st century notions of physical identity are melded into all the images that we confront on a daily basis, including the selfies, the thinspiration movement, where you can see how people are losing weight or gaining muscle based on the selfies that they put on social media. So I dug around and I found a slightly recent or a slightly contemporary photograph to show us that Munch wasn't heavily muscled, that he himself had the physique that I think we see in Self-Portrait in Hell. But it is such a despairing representation. You see how paint brushstrokes have really almost muddled his facial characteristics. We see this little pinpricks of eyes looking out at us. And perhaps the fragility of his human form was something he wanted to present to us. But go ahead.
No, it's curious that here we see the body more than any other aspect. I mean, the torso is what predominates in this image.
And you can see from the photograph in 1907, he was painting these massive canvases out in nature, wearing a long cloth. So he was probably painting himself as he was working in his studio, very relaxed and free with his body, and also but it's really, I always get into this quandary. Do we rely on a title to tell us the meaning of the artwork?
Right.
Did he give the title to this artwork, or did someone else give it to it?
Right.
And so, yeah, but to me, even if he is manipulating his body and thinking about androgyny and maybe negotiating his way between female and male physical characteristics, emotional characteristics, that's really awesome. And that's interesting for us to think about.
For sure. I find the issue of titles so interesting because oftentimes books, and that's more my area, the titles aren't necessarily what the authors themselves pick, right? and certainly not the cover art usually. So it's interesting, and you know, I noticed, for example, a trend in more modern and contemporary art of just calling things untitled, but then in parentheses a possible title that probably someone else has given, probably for issues of cataloging and so forth.
Exactly. I warn my students of that it can happen. Cindy Sherman's work was never supposed to have titles. Everything was untitled. But registrars and curators around the world got very frustrated trying to keep them all, track of all of them. And so they sometimes do give them parenthetical reference points.
Right. I also find this interesting because the face, as you had mentioned earlier, looks like a mask. Like there's not quite a death mask, but definitely a mask on it.
And you might wonder, in 1906 is when Pablo Picasso becomes so influenced with African masks and sculpture and incorporates some of those references in his work. Maybe Munch was encountering the same sort of ethnographic exhibits in cities like Berlin. Perhaps not Oslo, but maybe, and so that might be informing his work too. But I think that the size of his head has become so diminished, whether it's cast in some sort of hazy, shadowy environment, it just looks as if that part of his body is not as detailed.
Right. That connection with masks is quite fascinating. With the Picasso and the encounter with masks from other non-European cultures. And it also makes me think of our current political, social dilemma over masking only parts of our face and who does and who does not, and what that tells you about political and social affiliations. It's fascinating. I don't know quite how to unpack it, but the issue of masks here and in sort of broader terms is fascinating to me.
Oh, I agree. I recently saw a news story about the use of artificial intelligence to track people using their facial characteristics. And I thought, well, all of us are wearing masks now, so good luck with that.
It's so funny, yeah, because I've gone to a few protests, maintaining social distance and wearing masks, and it turns out that other people that I know have been at them, but I couldn't find them because I can't recognize anybody. Partly because none of us have had haircuts, so there's that. But also, if you're masked, all I see is your eyes. I can't tell who you are. It's quite fascinating.
I did see a company is now doing 3D printing from a photograph. So the lower part of your face, your mask can look a little bit more like you.
Which is a little frightening because that will play into the hands of AI and facial recognition technology. And I'm just waiting for Facebook to come up with a game app that, hey, take a picture of yourself with a mask and use that as your profile pic so we can gather your data.
Right.
I mean, would that surprise you? It wouldn't surprise me.
No.
But, okay, back to Monk, sorry.
Okay. A year later, he's presenting himself as a very professional person. Suit, overcoat, and you really get a sense that he is now trying to negotiate into the middle class, his patronage, and what that is going to say about himself. And to me, this almost looks like a business card or maybe a way of branding him so that his patrons feel comfortable, talking to him about, this is the kind of portrait I'd like to have of my daughter, or, but it seems so contained. After you look at Self-Portrait in Hell or The Scream, you see this and you think, are these all the same person? What's going on?
Very, very true. They're radically different, really. Yeah. Oops, sorry. I think I moved the car.
That's okay.
This is where we are. Yes.
Yep. But now we have his portrait that's identified as one when he painted, as he is recovering or inflicted with the influenza. from 1918, a pandemic that swept through Europe and the United States and was just so devastating. And here, the use of color, you talked about how we hadn't really seen much color since the scream. Here we have such vibrant color. And I wonder if that is a reaction to illness, that he wanted to, now that he is perhaps, you know, getting better or feeling better, he wants to celebrate life and world and use color to do that. The inclusion of just a bed and a chair really gives you a sense that he's negotiating, or this is his life, that he has either, you know, been resting in his bed or placed up in a chair. And then the bright light that is coming through, I imagine, a couple of windows really does create a very different environment in which he places himself.
It's quite interesting because the colors to me also sort of contrast with the evident physical weakness or deterioration, even if he's in recovery, but the colors seem to be in contrast to the physical state of the body that I find so interesting. I also think I mentioned to you that this painting also reminded me of Whistler's mother. Is that yeah? And I don't know if he saw that other image, but it strikes me as a very similar composition.
It really does have that quality of containment. Again, rather than having someone stand or pose for you, they're seated. And I think that makes them almost you know, protected by furniture. And so they, you know, this might speak to his physical frailty. Recovering from something like this must have been incredibly challenging at that time, and wanting to recover too, when there's so much around you that is illness and discomfort. So many of us, you know, find our inner strength and decide, well, I'm going to beat this, and this is me beating this. And I think that this self-portrait gives us that sense. Even though we can't really read his facial expression, his eyes look, again, sort of almost sunken into his head, but he might be here trying to depict some of the dehydration, some of the physical wasting that occurred during the illness.
I also find it interesting that at least in all of the images that we've seen, the subject himself is always looking at the viewer. Not like Whistler's mother is different because her vision is the side profile. So anyway, it's just sort of interesting that his presence, he's also present in his paintings because he's looking at you.
And that's a very powerful thing. And you've noticed he doesn't include some of the other identifiers that we would include in a self-portrait. Where is his canvas? Where is the easel? Where are his paintbrushes? Where are his paint pots? He hasn't included any of that in the self-portrait. And I think that's also telling too. It might have taken him much longer to create this because of his physical weakness. And so he didn't want to include those things.
Right.
You know, they're added pieces of furniture. It's a very stark sort of almost, it doesn't have the same feeling as a hospital room, because you imagine at this time, many people would be placed in a hospital room. So it does have a little bit of a sense of isolation presented. But he might have felt maybe I'm crowding the image by including my easel or even my paintbrushes.
Right, right.
I think on the next slide, I talk about this recent article that suggested that his facial features, or the expression on his face in the self-portrait Spanish influenza, mirrors the one we see in the scream. I was looking at the paintbrush strokes as best I could online. Unfortunately, I haven't seen either one of these pieces in life, but I'm not wholly convinced. I see that, you know, the facial structure is sort of like a light bulb shape. So yeah, maybe, but I don't see his mouth gaping open in self-portrait Spanish influenza.
It's hard to tell. I mean, I can see how those correlate, but it's so vague, I guess, that I think it's very difficult to tell for sure. Yeah.
And you might have noticed that his figures have become much more realistic, three-dimensional at this time. This is after he has received electroshock therapy and cut down on his alcohol consumption.
Is that what is that what the electroshock was for? It was for alcoholism?
They believe that that was one of the treatments he sought, but it was really abstinence that allowed him to survive his addiction. And it did occur before 1918, all of these things. But his painting style changes. It becomes a little bit more, I would say, realistic. That the monk in the seat looks much more three-dimensional. It has volume and depth, and he's creating a context where we find him seated that is realistic. It looks like a room. We look like we have a bed there too. Whereas some of his other figures are a little bit more spectral-like or ghost-like prior to the treatment for alcoholism.
Right.
And then we have after the Spanish flu. And here you can see another brilliant use of color, really great contrasts between blues and greens, and then the pinks and the oranges. Now, they're not necessarily realistic skin tones here, but I think it's this way of maybe depicting that energy of life and that the power of life coming back. His face looks a little fuller, so he might be, enjoying a little bit of a weight gain, a little bit more physical energy, but he still gives us the sense of this interior space. And then I wondered, is that the same chair from the previous self-portrait? Mm-hmm. And by stepping out of it and pushing it to the background, is he saying, this is how healthy I am. This is how much stronger I feel that I can step away from a chair and paint myself.
It's very interesting.
And he also puts himself very close to the picture plane. So again, it looks like he might even be leaning over or trying to negotiate a closer relationship with the viewer.
Right. Yeah, and we see a rather clear face, which is unusual for him in many of the self-portraits.
I agree. And I really wonder, again, how many other artists painting at this time have influenced him. I see Matisse here, the very bright splashes of color and how they are found in different parts of the composition. You saw that in some of his other work, but not quite organized in this way.
Right. I also like that, even though the dominant colors scheme is blues, greens, grays, you still notice very much the other color spectrums that is sort of more hopeful or lively or with light. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then one of the last ones he painted was from 1942 or thereabouts. This quotation, "I was born dying," is such a powerful statement because he was really surrounded by death, having his mother die when he was a child, then a sister die, and other life experiences haunted him. And I can imagine, as a survivor of a pandemic, there were issues there as well. The inclusion of the grandfather clock kind of reminds me of the passing of time and that idea of a memento mori. And that becomes such a powerful reference in this interior scene. But we still see recognizable things, paintings on the walls, a door that perhaps is open, leading into another space. But there's lots of verticality in this composition. He is standing so stock still, hands in his pockets, or one hand in his pocket. Are his hands in his pockets? Those are probably his hands.
I think like his thumbs are in the pockets. It looks like the thumbs are in the pockets, maybe.
Yeah, but like this static sense of self. Mm-hmm. And perhaps a little bit more contained, as you said, over the decades of his life. Perhaps he was able to control some of that psychic energy that boiled up and created something like the screen.
I also find it interesting that we see his face. The grandfather clock's face, if you will, is devoid of any identifying characteristics. The portrait here in the back doesn't have any. And then we have this figure here, which looks like a female nude, actually.
He did have a number of romantic liaisons with various women throughout his life, but he really, I think, never made a true connection with a female. That I think he saw them as temptresses. We see that in some other examples of his work. And perhaps the idea of free love that was introduced in the lifestyle in Berlin was a bit overwhelming for him, that he just didn't feel comfortable in that environment, or trying to negotiate, how do I create a long-standing relationship with a person when I've seen so much death, when
Right.
I've witnessed so much suffering.
Mhm. Well, thank you for this introduction and overview of Monk. And I think next we have, yes,
Sheila.
Stranger.
Now, although Sheila is an Austrian artist, we have no real evidence that he was reading Sigmund Freud and then applying those theories to his work. But yeah, it's quite possible in the cafes in Vienna, he was overhearing some of the theories that were being proposed by psychologists and by Freud at the time. He was certainly influenced by his mentor, Gustav Klimt. A sad note is that Gustav Klimt also passed during the time of the Spanish flu pandemic, and Sheila was given the responsibility of drawing his death mask.
Oh, really?
Yes, it was a drawing, but it's such a poignant portrayal of, you can imagine that relationship between mentor and student. In 1911, Sheila wrote, "I want to tear into myself so that I create again a new thing, which I, in spite of myself, have perceived." And I think that's what we see in his self-portraits. He was primarily a portraitist. We do see examples of his work that are landscapes, but the portraits, and I think this is where perhaps I read a little bit too much into it, is where he's trying to negotiate the idea of the id. What are those hidden desires and concerns that we shield from the rest of the world, that he can reveal to us because he sees them in a way. He has this ability to see past the mask of complacency or social propriety, and shows us a different side of ourselves. And I think his self-portraits do that too. This is a relatively early one in his career. His career only spans around 18 years.
Wow.
So it's, 10 years. Not doing my math very well. But it's surprising to see, because his work is so revolutionary. You always see an example of a Sheila work in an art history textbook, because it is such a monumental departure from how other people are painting portraits, depicting the world around them. So in this one, we see how he has removed the things that tether us to this world. He has removed his feet, his hands. Some people interpret that his hands are clenched, but looking at the proportion of his arms, I'm thinking that he has removed his hands. And then he is also presenting himself with no context, no environment in which we find him. So we kind of think of him as seated for this particular self-portrait, but he's exposing his fragility and also this sort of floating quality by removing his hands, the tools of his trade as an artist, and then also his feet as if he's not really of this earth.
And also the frank nakedness, particularly of the male figure. It's not uncommon, of course, to have naked females in art, but it is somewhat uncommon to have naked males, and especially as a self-portrait. I find that fascinating.
And he's really attenuated his body. So it looks almost like a wooden sculpture where someone has actually pared away additional forms. You see how this large depression in his right thigh at the upper part of his thigh looks very unrealistic. And then the hip bones are jutting out. You see the blades of the shoulder blades. And so his body looks like it's been carved out of something other than flesh and bone.
Right.
It's very quite, it's to me, it's intriguing how he is revealing his humanness, because we would think flesh, bone, those are the elements, but here he sculpted them almost in an odd way. Other art historians looking at this work also note his very great attention to detail on the hair of his legs and his arms. And so there's also this tactile quality to the self-portrait that some people might find a little disconcerting. Why take all the time to paint out the hairs on your thigh when it's so grotesquely misshapen and molded? Shouldn't we be talking about that? Shouldn't you be thinking about that? But it's a stunning self-portrait. He's also painted his eyes as red orbs.
There's something almost tactile about the image. Yeah.
I agree.
Another side eye, perhaps.
Yes, another side eye. To me, I call this the punk self-portrait, because he looks like a punk. The tilt of his head and the way he's crossed his arms over his body really gives us a sense that he's impatient with us. We probably said something that annoyed him, but he wanted to have this negotiation with the viewer and perhaps with himself. Again, think that this is being painted by looking at a mirror, seeing your own reflection, and then thinking, well, let's tilt. What happens when I tilt my head? My neck elongates. And then where are my eyes located? It has haughtiness and bravado. It reminds me really of someone of this age. He's again in his early 20s, and you just sort of get that energy from it.
Yeah, definitely. It strikes me as very familiar.
Yes.
And as we work with young people, well, and we have children.
That too. There's a wonderful self-confidence that is presented here. And he's using gouache, which is a technique that has layers of sometimes translucent color built up. And so you can see different colors that he's used when presenting his facial features. You can't really make out his cheekbone, but he's used some blues and pinks around his nostrils to convey that. The eyes also look a little bit out of proportion, as if that's where our attention ought to be drawn, which I think is interesting. I'm fascinated by how people manipulate their physical characteristics to present a self-portrait.
Right, especially nowadays when your phone has all sorts of apps that can alter your selfie picture.
Absolutely. We believe that this is actually a companion piece to a portrait of Walburga Wally Neutzel. At this time, she was a model for him. We believe they had a romantic relationship that he cut off because she wasn't a woman of means. And he needed to marry well. I guess that's how best to put it. But can you imagine these two paintings sort of looking at each other on different sides of a room? Because those gazes are so poignant. She has her face turned down and looking up at him, perhaps trying to curry favor or showing some sort of emotional connection. And he's looking down at her with a little bit of disdain. I've had enough of you, I think. But it's such a powerful idea that he would have a companion piece to a self-portrait.
It is very interesting. Yeah, I was going to say he looks kind of haughty and disdainful, and she looks more supplicant and wide-eyed, innocent, maybe. It's quite revealing, given how their relationship developed, let's say.
Absolutely. And then we have other pieces where he has distorted his facial features, but also his body. Here, you're not quite sure how to read this piece. Is he wearing a piece of cloth that's exposing his shoulder, or has he bumped his shoulder up to reveal even the part of the collarbone and exaggerate that? But you can also see that the technique that he used, these washes of color are quite translucent. And then you can see swirl patterns and how he can misshape his physical features. Again, could this be a mask? Could this be his way of masking what he was feeling at the time?
I also find it interesting that in this one and the previous one, the use of blue in the hair and the face, it's quite interesting.
He's often depicted himself with this sort of mad hair style. You can see that in this self-portrait as well, from the same year. And so we're just, you know, he just really had this short career between 1910 and 1918, but such an explosion of representations of the world around him through his self-portraits and also his portraits. Those are equally engaging. This one is found at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I just found it so powerful, the use of the white line that exaggerates the thinness of his hips, the sunken nature of his chest, how you can see almost every rib in his rib cage. And then why not include the hand? Is this an unfinished self-portrait? Possibly.
But so many of the other ones haven't had hands or feet or, yeah.
Exactly. So this could be his way of, you know, ignoring that part of his body. It's often said that hands are very difficult to draw because just their shape and how they can be formed and seated in so many ways. But we'll see with other works and even photographs of Sheila, he really liked hands. He did a lot of hand gestures in these photographs. And so you kind of wonder, perhaps this is an unfinished work.
It's also interesting with the white outline that it looks like it's emerging from the paper or canvas that it's printed on. I
agree. It could also be an idea of psychic energy radiating off of him. You know, most people, when they think of halos, people wearing halos in Christian art, that is a representation of holiness, but it's supposed to be this radiating light that sort of lights you from within and is presented as a halo.
Well, and his hair functions as that too, this sort of wild protrusion of hair.
And then here we have another portrait with Wally. I look at his pieces and think about how he's almost, I don't remember the term, but it's almost as if he's disjointed some of his joints. And here he's exaggerated the length of his hand as he's sort of patting the head of Wally. But one question I wanted to ask you is, are they awake or asleep?
Well, I look at them as awake with their eyes open, but
Okay.
That's me.
Well, I think it's really difficult to see any reference to a pupil or an iris. And looking at this, I noticed, you know, how awkwardly he's posed. It's almost as if his legs are wrapped around Wally. She is embracing him at the torso, and then his face is sort of resting on his shoulder. It has this sort of awkward feel. So in the next slide, I actually propose that it is an image of them lying down. But yeah, that the stamp signature in the lower corner, now it's in the lower right-hand corner, is not oriented to this form, but perhaps that's a stamp that was put on the piece of paper later.
Right.
Yeah, it's really, but I think here it looks a little bit more like a couple's embrace.
It does, although this reinforces the supplicant nature of Wally in relationship to him. So yeah, I don't know. I sort of see this as reminding us of who's in control.
Yeah, the patting of the head is very patronizing. Yeah, paternalistic, and here it almost looks, you know, if they were indeed, you know, embraced and asleep, it's almost like a loving gesture, just resting your head, hand on her head.
Yeah, here it's a more tender image for sure.
Yeah. And then we have the self-portrait of Saint Sebastian that was part of an exhibition poster that he designed. Although he served in World War I, he was still creating artwork and promoting his work. And so I found this a fascinating presentation here. You can see the exaggerated hand gestures. Again, we're not quite sure what he's gesturing. There's one that looks a little bit like a W. Someone has suggested that they have connections to hip hop hand gestures. I've asked my students, tell me what these gestures mean. They haven't been able to answer those questions, but I haven't found. I've even looked back at symbolic gestures in Christianity, the different gestures of blessing, and trying to see, well, what would this W? I can do this. I can't do the W thing. I've been practicing and it doesn't work. But what is that referencing? Is it some sort of secret code that he presents in his work? Here he's also dressed in this orange jumpsuit that's quite vibrant, but we're not quite sure what is the significance. Why would he present himself as Saint Sebastian? Right. Looking at the more recent presentation about pandemics in the ancient world and representations of Saint Sebastian, and the idea that all of these arrows are the sort of the ways of representing plague and suffering.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that's something I also learned by participating in the module on pandemics in the ancient world, that the origin of this is Apollo and the beginning of the Iliad, and Apollo shooting arrows of plague into the armies. And then Apollo morphs into Saint Sebastian, who was also killed, killed multiple times. One of the ways was with arrows, right? And that the arrows then are plague. The arrows then make him the saint of that one calls to for salvation from plague, which was also Apollo. Some of the ancient sources talk about how people would have prayers to Apollo to save them from the plague. And plague here, of course, metaphorical, perhaps referencing World War I, perhaps referencing other things. And of course, as something that I've also mentioned to you, the Saint Sebastian as tied also to gay iconography as well, which is fascinating. And I don't mean to imply anything about his sexuality, but the frankness of sexual expression in his work and the naked body is what is interesting to me. And so I think there's potential for seeing various things at play here that are rich ways of sort of understanding and looking.
Absolutely. I haven't done much reading into how Sheila's work was received by the art world at this time, because his career, again, now this is mid-career between 1914 and 1915, where he is advertising his art. But as a person who reads a lot of art criticism, I'm thinking, could those be the stinging arrows of critics? Could are those the barbs that are piercing his body? All of those negative or critical reviews of his work.
It's also interesting, his face, unlike the other ones here, there's something more humble or pleading about it, unlike the sort of arrogance that you find in the other images.
I read his eyes closed here. And so I'm thinking, yeah, I'm thinking that is sort of his way of internalizing any sort of pain and suffering that he's trying to depict.
Right.
There was something else I wanted. And then also just the idea that he is promoting his own work, creating his own exhibition posters is quite a powerful thing, that he is branding himself. And this is how he chooses to identify or reference his work to bring people into the gallery space. Mm-hmm. That it has, again, that sort of articulated form of a puppet, or he's sort of shattered his shoulders to make them look like they're being pulled by strings or manipulated in some way.
Yeah, no, it's quite an interesting image. Sorry, I accidentally skipped forwards.
But that's a great segue for this discussion, because this one is also one that I talk about being so much like a puppet. The way he has tilted his head so unrealistically on this tiny little neck. And then again, the hand gestures are quite obvious. Again, we're not quite sure how to read them, but you also wonder if during this time of success that he might feel manipulated by patrons or by the art world, and what the art world perceives what an artist is or what an artist ought to be. His shock of hair is now turned orange. Not quite sure about that. And his costume also looks kind of like something that a puppet might wear, something with bright stripes, or bright contrasty stripes in this case.
And also, as you mentioned here, the fact that he married Edith Harms instead of Wally, maybe a sort of manipulation of social expectations, things like that. And the costume as another form of posing, or another sort of mask, if you will.
Oh, absolutely. If you think about it, I mentioned here that 3 days after their marriage, he was forced to enlist in the army. So seeing men of his age putting on a new costume, a new mask of a military uniform, when they may not be particularly political or particularly engaged in wanting to join the fight.
Mm-hmm.
That could be another way of interpreting this piece.
Absolutely.
And then we have the family. So this was painted between 1917 and 1918. And after he had left fighting, he was able to establish his career a little bit more. I had read in some sources that we're not quite sure that this is a self-portrait, but it has facial characteristics that are similar to his other representations of self. And then this idea of a 20th century Holy Family is so poignant. If you think of him as Saint Joseph, and then Edith as the Virgin, and then this child, and the time frame in which it was created. We believe he started it early 1918, and then by October, all three of them were gone.
I think that's what's so poignant about this image, is that it's the Holy Family representation. It's hopeful, it's got future, it's got solidity to it. I mean, it's the first image that we've seen where he's grounded with a background of some sort. I mean, it's vague, but like clearly there's a floor, and clearly there's either a bed or a chair or some sort of grounding that we don't see in the earlier works. And then to know in retrospect that all three of them die within a year it's tragic and astounding and disruptive.
Very much so. And he gives his body actually some mass and weight that we hadn't seen before. So it gives us this impression that life is good, perhaps because of he had a lot of desk jobs during the war. So he was privy to getting extra rations for him and Edith. So perhaps, life was pretty good at this time. He wasn't the typical student who might skip a meal to work on their studies or to spend time in the studio. So he was maybe, growing up a little bit, taking a little bit better care of his body, knowing that there was Edith and there was the potential for a family and for a future.
Right. The bodies here are very substantive. There's physicality to them, unlike the earlier images that we saw.
Absolutely. And then I found some somewhat contemporary images. The portrait of Edith Seated from 1918 still belies the sense of her health and her demeanor. Not quite sure when exactly it was painted in 1918, but some people had suggested that the family is a memorial, that he was painting it as she was suffering from the epidemic. Again, it's really hard to tell when exactly someone is creating something without a daily journal describing this is the work I'm doing. And then just physical presence, that three-dimensional muscular form and groundedness that we had talked about, is in contrast, sadly, to this photograph I found by Martha Fine of Sheila on his deathbed, and how his body has wasted. You can see how thin his forearms are, how gaunt his face has become. And he also seemed to be diminutive. It didn't look like he had a very great muscular physique based on photographs prior to 1918.
It's strange because the photograph looks, I view it as quite peaceful, actually. I mean, I know that when one is dead, one is at peace, if you will, in certain circumstances, depending on how one passes. But it looks like he's just sleeping.
And I've never heard or gotten any sort of verification from sources when this photograph was taken. If it's him after he has died, or if this is just him sleeping in the bed where he eventually passes.
Mm-hmm.
But it does have that serene quality to it.
It sort of reminds me of some of the photographs from the early days of the AIDS epidemic, of people less restful in their death repose. But I see certain echoes between this photograph and the deathbed photographs of AIDS victims.
And then what we believe to be his last image of Edith, he has dated it. So we have that sense. Again, you always wonder, has someone backdated it? Was this Sheila's notation that it was the 28th of October when he drew this picture of her? But it does have that sort of presentation of Edith as her spirit might be leaving her body, as her physical strength is deteriorating. Her eyes are half closed. Her hand is sort of perched under her face as if she might be leaning on her hand to hold up her head.
You know, it's interesting. You talk about how this could represent sort of the ethereal escape of the soul, if you will, from the body. There's something so interesting about this drawing, because it's a drawing, or it looks like a drawing.
It's a chalk on paper, so yeah.
I find it both, how shall I say this? It's just lines, and yet it's both ethereal and substantive, because we see the face, we know this is a person. I mean, I feel like there's something both grounding in it, in its realness, and yet also sort of evaporating at the same time.
And I think that's one of the powers of his art, that he was able to depict so many different levels of a person's being, including himself. Mm-hmm. If you can imagine, he passed away, 3 days after Edith? So even his hand might not be that steady.
Right.
But he's still able to capture such beautiful line and form in this drawing.
And to capture that shortly before his own death and while watching his wife die, I just can't quite fathom the sort of mental spatial context of that, one's own suffering, watching someone else's suffering, and at the same time producing artistic memento of that moment. It's quite telling.
Very much so. And then our last slide is Mark Schwartz. Schultz, not Schwartz. Schultz. And you brought this to my attention, but I've been talking to friends about this. I don't show them this slide. I don't have my PowerPoints on my phone, but it's this idea that this healthy 43-year-old man, after 4.5 weeks of receiving treatment for COVID-19, could lose 25% of his body mass.
I find this image so fascinating because it speaks to our current selfie culture. It ties into the theme that you've been discussing of self-portraiture. We see sort of the sardonic confidence in the one image, and then the holy shit, I survived this in the other image. And you can see also he's got the scarring from either tracheotomy or intubation or something here on his neck. He's also got a pump in his stomach. There's so many things here, and the massive body loss, or body weight loss. I just find this image so interesting as a sort of modern take on the same things we saw in the artists themselves and their experience of the flu pandemic. And I find this image interesting because part of his motivation seems to be to show people COVID-19 is real. And I think that that's a message lost on a great many people.
And he survived after losing 50 pounds.
And he was clearly a person very much in shape and very healthy and within the proper age group to survive. And it's fascinating, people's assumptions about disease. Yeah.
Well, unlike Sheila, we aren't surrounded by death and disease until something strikes like this. I am haunted by images I had seen of victims of COVID-19 in Italy. There was a gentleman on the phone saying, my family member has passed away and she's lying in the bed behind me and I have no way of giving her a proper burial or even getting her remains out of my house in any timely fashion. What am I supposed to do?
No, these images are frightening. I mean, I remember the images out of Guayaquil, Ecuador, which people were just putting the bodies in the streets. And it made me think of images from the Black Death, where the cart would come around and the guy would shout, "Bring out your dead," on a daily basis. I mean, or the famous Italian novel by Manzoni about that, where the mother brings her infant daughter's body out and says, here's the money for my body, come pick me up tonight because I'll be dead by tonight. I mean, these sort of images of tragedy that we think aren't contemporary, but they are. And I think the lack of seriousness with which many people have approached this current issue is a little frightening. Yeah.
I agree. I mean, in New York State, we have taken such great strides to protect ourselves, to be sensible, and to respect and care for our neighbors, our friends, by wearing our masks and practice social distancing and all these things. And just if we can continue doing this, if we can be strong now, we are hopeful that the pandemic won't be a 3 to 4 year nightmare, right, that we can somehow control and contain it. And also to find a vaccine. As right, you can see, that the effects of survival are stark, but without a vaccine, how many of us will survive?
No, and how that will impact culture and behavior long term. I mean, without a vaccine, what do we do? I mean, I think that we're still at the early stages of figuring out how this will change and impact human culture and human behavior for a long time. I want to give you the opportunity if there's any last things you want to say about the two artists, and then I want to ask you one other question. But
I had such a wonderful opportunity here to delve more deeply into their lives. And on the reading list and resources, you can learn so much more about how these two artists were affected by the pandemic. But I'm sure there are so many other voices that were quieted that we don't know. And so we need to continue looking at histories and looking at the past for glimpses of what our present and what our future can be.
I think that's an important lesson to remember is memory, right? And there was a unit or a module in the course with Christopher Bram and Philip Clark about memory and literary production in terms of the 1918 flu pandemic, which parallels this, as well as the AIDS pandemic. And it was curious that not much literature was written about the flu pandemic because it was so horrible, people wanted to forget about it. And that was also the case with AIDS, which lasted longer and still is with us. But it took a while before people were able to approach it from an artistic point of view and write about it. And so I find it's interesting to me that we have these two artists who managed to paint about and through the flu pandemic, but in general, doesn't seem to be much about it, artistically speaking. And that makes me think about how are we going to remember and process meaning out of the current disease that we're going through globally.
I think it'll be very interesting to see what sort of records we leave behind. The legacy and the idea of memory to me is so poignant, thinking about the photographs that are now circulating of people wearing masks during the 1918 pandemic, and thinking, what strides they took, how people wouldn't be allowed on public transportation if they didn't have a mask, right, or if they looked ill. That's the other thing too. In American culture, it seems that we are taught to push through. I've gone to work many times feeling physically ill, but I just say, drink a cup of tea, you'll be fine, get through this. But now I'm trying to listen a little bit more to my body and be more aware of maybe we shouldn't be going in if we don't feel well, that we're doing a disservice not only to us, but those around us.
Right, definitely. I think it'll be interesting to see as time goes on whether these personal behavioral adaptations are long-term and more culturally broad, or whether they're temporary. I think it'll be interesting to see. And I know that, for example, Canisius is producing quite a bit of signage to encourage a change in behavior. We shall see if human behavior is actually as malleable as we would like it to possibly be. Well, I want to thank you, Vanessa. I've learned a lot. I want to just make a plug for one of my artists here, Frida, because even though it's not a plague, she paints from a place of isolation, of quarantine, because of her body, essentially. I mean, she also had polio, which was a global disease. But I find, I did a project with my students this semester, and many of them chose to reinterpret, a modern selfie reinterpreting of Frida work. They didn't have to do Frida, but many of them chose that. And many of them also chose to write about Frida as an inspiration for how to get through a difficult time. And so their final project was one of two things. One was recreate an artwork, which was a trend, right, with social media. And the other was to talk about the course and what the course may have spoken to them and what parts of the course may have resonated with them to give meaning to push through the quarantine and the pandemic and so forth. And many of them spoke about Frida as being inspirational in that regard, because despite being stuck at home often, despite limitations, despite so many things that would engender frustration or anger or depression, became sources of that she was still able to find joy or beauty or meaning. And I think that's an important lesson to take from all of these artists, whether it's Frida or Sheila, to find that art has answers for us. We just have to look at it.
Oh, absolutely. I've been so excited to see all of the living tableaus that people have been creating. And Frida, even also for my students taking the self-portrait course, they find her grace and her beauty. And as you said, finding beauty in sadness, depression, loneliness, and physical pain too. She had suffered so much through surgeries, and but you know, it's just it was her way of negotiating those times of despair, and the idea that her, you know, while she was recovering, her father handed her those magic paintbrushes and paints. That is such a wonderful gift too. I found during the shutdown that a lot of students were doing their own artworks. And so having an opportunity, as you said, you sort of time to listen to the birds. It's also time to take out the coloring pencils or to draw something using computer software or to photograph, document what you see. And also a lot of people were getting family portraits taken, which I thought was wonderful too. Of course, our hair is a mess,
Right.
but it's a way to document this time together. What a wonderful gift that is, just being able to be together with those you love.
For sure, for sure. I think that there are sometimes silver linings to tragedies, and reminding ourselves of both nature and of the value of the people around us are important things to remember. Well, thank you, Yvonne, for this wonderful conversation. And for our listeners, I hope you'll join us for our second conversation with Yvonne about arts and crafts and crisis. So thank you.
Thank you.